oh, those rich people, they just inherit all their money, just passing it on from father to son. You've heard that before. Maybe you've even said it before. Of course, rich people means anyone with more money than us, right? Even after all of our multi-million-dollar estates out here in Lavaca County. But during coffee, I know someone's going to come up to me and say, Pastor, $1 million just doesn't go as far as it used to these days. See, by and large, research shows that millionaires earn their money in the first generation. They don't inherit it. And what's more surprising, or perhaps sad and disappointing, is that inherited wealth, intergenerational wealth, is almost always gone by the third generation. First generation earns it, the second generation attempts to maintain it, and the third generation must retool and reinvest, and not always wisely. This is true both for cash and assets, as well as businesses. Third generation businesses are rare, and fourth generation ones are like hen's teeth. And so counterintuitively, for intergenerational, multi-generational wealth to endure, it must do so without or in spite of those future generations. It's got to be out of their hands. It must be protected from them, and it must be protected for them if it's to endure across the decades, even the centuries. Now, King David's dynasty, it does a little bit better than 3 generations. 20 kings eventually will sit on the Judean throne over about 400 years until 587 BC, which sort of makes the careful reader wonder a little bit about hearing words such as forever several times in the story. And despite all the warnings throughout the Old Testament that the promised land can be forfeited as a punishment, does forever really mean forever in this story? Now, sometimes this account is known as the Davidic covenant, the covenant with King David, even though the word covenant doesn't appear in the text. Of course, as we've been working through this for a few Sundays, we remember some covenant basics. It's between a greater party and a lesser party. Each has duties of allegiance or loyalty toward the other. And if one side breaks it, well, the other side's faithfulness continues in order to call the offending party back into alignment. The Old Testament's got lots of covenants between various folks, but we've focused our attention on the covenants that God makes with his people. Covenants made with Noah and all the earth following the flood. Covenants made with Abraham that his offspring will be God's people. A covenant made at Mount Sinai with Moses and the people after the Exodus, right? That's the Ten Commandments story. Time and again, the Israelites must renew the covenant with God because they break it. From the golden calf, which happens right after the Ten Commandments, to the fiery serpents while they're wandering in the wilderness, all the way even to the homecoming from the exile centuries later. And then here a covenant is made with David and his descendants regarding the throne of Judah. And then a new covenant is promised with the prophet Jeremiah. We'll hear that on Maundy Thursday. And these covenants are getting more and more specific. Their focus is narrowing. We begin with Noah and all the earth, and now we're considering the kingship over just the nation of Judah. This covenant with David and his sons after him marks a significant milestone in God's connection with his people. And we just noticed that this is funneling down across the century. So almost 1,000 years have passed from Abraham and Isaac, his son Isaac, to David and his son Solomon. In the covenant with Abraham, we hear the man that Abraham must become in order to have his son Isaac. And it doesn't stop at Isaac's birth. Abraham must continue becoming this new man in order for Isaac not only to be born, but to grow up and to inherit the covenantal promise for himself. With the Davidic covenant, we hear of the man that his son and future grandsons must become in order to continue the covenantal promises. The future son will build the Jerusalem temple. He will be like a son to God who will father him. And he will be punished and chastised by God for his sins and failures. But God will not revoke his steadfast loving kindness, which is what happened to King Saul. And so the kingdom of David historically comes to an end in 587 BC when Nebuchadnezzar conquers Jerusalem. And it's not until 538 BC that King Cyrus and the Persians, after conquering the Babylonians, allow the Jews, the Judeans and some of the Israelites, to return to Jerusalem and reestablish its government. A government, though, without a king. So what gives? Did God change his mind about his forever promise? Well, it's less about God revoking his side of the deal than it is about Judea just giving up on theirs. The fact of the reestablishment of a semi-self-governing Judea is evidence that God did not take his steadfast loving kindness away. Now, no shortage of contemporary birth of Jesus movies and shows play up the notion that the ancient Jews who lived in the centuries between the Old and New Testaments believed in a coming Messiah who would restore King David's throne. The disciples and the crowds around Jesus routinely make this very mistake. Of course, while we can't speak for everyone in those centuries, we can deduce that it was a contemporary, animating belief of many, many people. And then Jesus takes this notion for himself, especially at his crucifixion as he is labeled King of the Jews. So in a very real way, we see these thousands of years of covenants, and specifically this Davidic one, coming to a point in Jesus' life. So in John 12 in the Gospel today, Jesus predicts his death. And this story takes place during Holy Week, the last week of Jesus' life, his ministry on earth. And as is often the case in John's Gospel, the language is pretty elaborate, eloquent, sort of encoded. I mean, take for instance Jesus' words, "When I am lifted up." That could mean when he's elevated to a higher socio-political position, perhaps this kingship that so many are anticipating. And of course, kings are literally lifted up on their thrones and lifted up on their litters as they are carried about by servants to be adored by subjects. I suppose there is a certain temptation in Lent to treat everything as a 42-part in-depth exploration and meditation on Good Friday. And we're not going to do that, even if we still have Palm Sunday and Maundy Thursday coming up in this series. However, Jesus' prediction here of his death gives some insight into this covenant with David from 1,000 years before. Before we get to that, though, we need to understand something about the connection that endures between God and his Old Testament people. See, even during the Babylonian exile, even during the homecoming and the restoration, even during the Greek oppression, even during the Roman treaty that becomes the Roman oppression, during all of these socio-political trials, rallies and disappointments that the Judean people face, God's steadfast loving kindness for his people endures. And we sort of take that for granted as a matter of course, but despite Jewish assertions, the ancient world did not see it that way. See, in the ancient world, when your people got conquered, when they lost a battle, well, your religion lost too, and it was conquered. It became subservient to the new empire's religion. And in fact, if you refused this new and improved religion from your new emperor, it was feared that you might corrupt the entire empire and everything. Even your meager estate as a conquered person would be worse off, if not total chaos on the face of the earth. And so eventually what would happen is your religion would die out and sometimes take on a hybrid new form. Yet with Judaism, something else happens. See, they believe that they have been planted there to live in their own place, just as verse 10 says. And the Jews are pretty fierce, independent, and zealous about their God and the Ten Commandments and so forth. And they generally refuse to assimilate with armed resistance many times. And the Jews realize that despite their own sins and failures, God's steadfast loving kindness has endured and has brought them to the present moment. And so they must be faithful as well, as God has been faithful to them for thousands of years. Remember what we said earlier about one party's loyalty brings the other party back. So here in Jesus' life, as his 3 years of public ministry come to a head here in Holy Week, folks can feel in the air that God's steadfast loving kindness has brought them to this point with this man who they hope and wish just might be the Messiah. And then Jesus goes on this weird jag about a seed dying and himself being lifted up from the earth. He's priming the pump for what's fixing to happen, so folks will realize, in hindsight, that God's steadfast loving kindness has been shown to them even on the cross. The Davidic covenant says that God will not take his steadfast love from the future king there in verse 15. His throne and his kingdom will be made sure forever in 16. That brings us back around to Jesus' little jag here in John 12. When I am lifted up, he says. But this doesn't refer to the way a king is normally elevated above his people on a throne. Jesus knows he's going to be hoisted up on the cross for all to see as King of the Jews, his ignominious title there on this throne of sorts. And then following the resurrection, the disciples can then later place their fingers in his hands and feet and his side. And so some way this cross becomes his throne forever. Indeed, the most messianic thing that Jesus does is to die upon the cross for the sake of his people, saving them not from Romans, not from Greeks, but from sin and death and the devil. In fact, many of us learned as children to hold our hands thusly to receive communion, just as St. Cyril of Jerusalem writes back in the 300s, make your left hand like a throne for your right, which is about to receive the king. And in verses 9 and 11, God promises that David's name will be great and glorious and enduring. And the gospel lesson, Jesus says, Father, glorify your name. And the Father responds that he has already done so and will do so again. See, this glory is greater than that of a fancy temple or of riches or of a long and wise dynasty. It's not the glory of an empire or the glory of an army or a battle or a statue. The glory that Jesus has is the very glory of God and his steadfast loving kindness which endures, even through death and the grave. It's easy to think that on the cross, Jesus' would-be kingdom has ended before it even really begins. And just as David's kingdom is gone, so is Jesus's. But Jesus gives us this riddle of sorts that we understand in hindsight. Unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. So remember, Abram, right, who then becomes Abraham, was as good as dead when Isaac was born. And then later, Abraham had to sacrifice Isaac, bringing him to the point of death before the promise would continue. And David cannot take the kingdom of Judah any further, so he must leave it for his son Solomon to take after him and make it great. And eventually, those descendants can't take things any further, and they must leave it for a future king after the exile. And finally, Jesus arrives, the point at which all the covenants have been narrowing and funneling to. Jesus, both the son of King David and the son of God the Father. Remember that covenantal promise, I will be a father to him and he shall be a son to me. And Jesus will take things not merely to the point of suffering and death at human hands for iniquity, point at which all human things fail. Jesus will take this divine kingdom and its people and God's steadfast loving kindness through and past suffering and death, and then opening things up and broadening them to life beyond death. Making sure forever not merely David's kingdom, not merely Abraham's lineage, but his own kingdom, not of this world, and his own people, born not of blood, but of water and the Spirit, sharing in the glory of God forever. Amen.